Hello. For the past several lectures, we've been focusing primarily on Southern and indeed on South Africa, looking at the creation of the Cape Colony, the transformation of the Southern Bantu peoples in the process we call the Imfakane, on the frontier conflict, and on the discovery of diamonds and gold. At this point, let us widen our lens again to examine the larger dimensions of Africa's relations with the outside world. In the 19th century period, we might consider it an interlude, the period between the ending of the Atlantic slave trade and the onset of outright European conquest and partition of the continent. This era of interlude raises some intriguing and sometimes contradictory events, trends, possibilities, and it presents some interesting examples of what we might call what-if questions. In other words, I'll give one example which does emerge here. What if European conquest and colonization had not come at the end of the 19th century? Could Africa have experienced some kind of modernization in the absence of that colonization? Now, Britain abolished the transoceanic slave trade in 1807, and slavery itself in the British Empire, including the Cape Colony, as we saw in the 1830s. Most, though not all, Western nations followed suit in terms of banning the international slave trade, although, of course, the actual abolition of slavery itself assumed various dates in places like the United States or Brazil. Now, abolition of the slave trade certainly reflected humanitarian currents in the West, related, of course, to the Enlightenment. I do not in any sense want to underplay those. It seems to me it is a disservice to the memory of fighters for emancipation and abolition like Olaudah Equiano, Frederick Douglass, T. Full Buxton, William Lloyd Garrison, who, for ideological and indeed moral reasons, showed enormous courage and labored tirelessly for the ending of chattel slavery. But it is also relevant to mention that the period of abolition corresponded with the rise of industrial, as opposed to mercantile, capitalism. Industrial capitalism's emphasis came to rest, of course, on, among other things, free labor, and in this sense we mean wage labor, as opposed to chattel slave labor. Now, the implication of this for West Africa was essentially this, that the external demand for West African products shifted. The demand for enslaved human laborers fell, and that for other commodities rose. For instance, and perhaps most prominently, the product of palm oil obtained from palm kernels, used originally to lubricate the rapidly multiplying machines of the industrial age. The demand for palm oil is, to me, a perfect example of how a shift in the political economy, in this case the shift to industrial capitalism in Europe, has genuine implications for other parts of the world, and palm oil, the product of a tropical plant, becomes crucial in the operation of the technology of the Industrial Revolution. Palm oil also used in a very different sort of way, and that is in the making of soap. And indeed, originally a soap like palm olive drew its name from the two products which went into it. Now, Britain put teeth into its slave trade prohibition, again, partly driven by matters of principle, by moral concerns, and partly in the interest of fostering and overseeing a conversion to a different kind of commercial focus in West Africa. The British Navy stationed ships off of the West African coast, and intercepted slave ships of all nations on the high seas. The human cargo of these ships, if I can put it that way, was resettled at a quite fascinating cultural experiment known as Freetown, appropriately enough, and located along the Atlantic Ocean coast of what today is the West African country of Sierra Leone. Now, the era of legitimate commerce, as the Europeans like to call it, in contradistinction, of course, to the now illegitimate commerce in human beings, the era of legitimate commerce was born. To the demand for palm oil was added the demand for other kinds of products coming out of West Africa. For instance, gum arabic, a dye fixer for the textile industry, and again, something that goes directly into the new industrial age, which has become the name of the game in Western Europe. Another product from the far western portions of the West African region, and that is peanuts. Now, some remarkable West African entrepreneurs arose to organize enterprises taking advantage of these new market realities. To me, the most fascinating example probably is a man who was known by the name of Jaja. His base of operations was at the town of Opobo, located in the Niger Delta region of modern Nigeria. And in fact, this Niger Delta region came to be known as the Oil Rivers region, Oil Rivers area. But this was in reference to palm oil, despite the fact that today, oil production of a very different type, and of course I'm referring to enormous productions of petroleum, takes place in precisely the same region of modern Nigeria. Jaja was a former slave himself who had risen to become a sort of merchant king. And he perhaps illustrates an example of a difference at least in degree, with slavery as practiced in West Africa indigenously and slavery as practiced in the West. He was very successful in controlling the palm oil coming out of the Oil Rivers area, and indeed eventually achieved a near monopoly of that production. He felt he had to do this to counter what he saw as a European monopoly of purchase and shipping of the product out of Africa and to Europe. As Basil Davidson has put it in his descriptions of Jaja, he, quote, modernized in every way he could. He eventually persuaded one European shipper to break ranks with the cartel controlling the purchase of palm oil. He began to pursue, most intriguingly, the possibility of organizing and financing his own shipping lines, of purchasing and manning his own ships to carry the product directly to Europe, and of course avoid, therefore, these European middlemen. Now, Jaja's end, his fate, illustrates the way that matters were developing, the way that the wind was blowing as we move from the middle reaches of the 19th century towards the end. Here we must introduce another character of considerable importance in several portions of Africa, East, Central, and West, and that was Harry Johnston, later knighted and known, of course, as Sir Harry Johnston. Johnston had served as the British consul based on the island of Lagos off the southwestern Nigerian coast. It's worth mentioning at this point that some of the old outposts which the European powers involved in the slave trade had constructed in the long centuries prior to the period that I'm talking about, they were usually called forts or castles. Cape Coast Castle, for instance, Elmina Castle along the coast of modern Ghana. And these dotted the coast in the hands of the French or the Portuguese or the British or others involved in the slave trade. In the era of legitimate commerce, often these old outposts, these old forts or castles, so-called, become the entrepot. They become the gateways for a new commerce that we're discussing. And they also become the beachheads for a gradual, at least gradual for a while, a gradual expansion, a gradual showing of a more aggressive stance on the part of these European commercial powers as they inch outward from the old forts and castles, making a local level annexation here, another there. Lagos Island, for instance, Harry Johnston's base off the southwestern coast of modern Nigeria, annexed by the British in 1861. By the 1880s, Jaja had become not just a thorn in the side, but perceived to be an outright obstruction to the continued prosperity and the continued progress based on legitimate commerce, at least the European side of that. At a certain point, Harry Johnston sailed to the Oil Rivers area, taking with him the HMS Goshawk, a ship of the British Royal Navy. The Goshawk anchored off of Opobo town. It was crewed by 77 blue-jacketed Royal Navy sailors, we're told, and maybe more importantly, a couple of dozen cannon, which were trained on Opobo town. Johnston invited Jaja to come to his ship for a parley, a negotiating session. Jaja accepted the invitation. He was cautious enough to bring with him some 27 war canoes, holding about 700 of his own followers and men. When he came on board, he was escorted to a room which looked rather more like a courtroom than a negotiating table, perhaps. And Johnston presented Jaja with two choices. He could, in essence, surrender himself to Johnston, or he could return to Opobo, in which case he would face, as the town would face, the fire of the cannon from the HMS Goshawk. Now, Jaja, perhaps imagining that he could live to fight another day, concluded that he would give himself over to Johnston in order to avoid the damage to his own town and followers. He was taken across the coast to the west to Accra, off the base of modern-day Ghana, and again, one of these places that had been outposts during the slave trade and are now inching forward in a more aggressive stance, put on through a summary trial and exiled to the West Indies, where Jaja spent the last 5 years of his life. Now, the British Foreign Secretary at this time was Lord Salisbury. He would shortly later become the British Prime Minister, and indeed is a key figure in the process that we look at in more detail next time, and that is the full-scale scramble for Africa. As Foreign Secretary, of course, Salisbury received the various dispatches from consuls all over the world, and of course received a description of what had occurred in the Oil Rivers area of modern-day Nigeria. He minuted on the consul's dispatch. The way that the Colonial Office operated is that the original report is passed from official to official, and they all scribble in hand their own comments on it. And these were called the minutes of various officials. Salisbury's minute read like this: "Simply approve his conduct." This is in reference to Johnston. "We need not discuss the principles involved in this dispatch. They amount to this: that when a merchant differs from a native chief as to their respective rights, the native chief is to be deported." Thus Salisbury's conclusion, although he conceded in his own words, these are Salisbury's words, in other places it would be called kidnapping. Jaja's commercial initiatives were matched by equally interesting cultural and political experiments pursued by talented West Africans acting on their own during this 19th century interlude period. A number of these initiatives offer tantalizing hints of that what-if question I posed at the beginning. Could nations modernize without the experience of colonization? Let's examine a couple of these. At Freetown, the place I mentioned where the so-called recaptives were taken, these were the people who at one point were loaded onto ships intended to be transported across the Atlantic and to enter into slavery, but intercepted on the high seas of the Atlantic off of West Africa by the British Navy and taken because of the difficulty, of course, of any sort of relocation of such a varied cargo to their various homes, were taken to Freetown in modern-day Sierra Leone. And there they were dropped into. They were immersed into something of a cultural bath. They were from, of course, many parts of West Africa, but put into a situation where they found themselves going to schools, conducting their lessons in English, and of course to churches dedicated to the Christian religion, and indeed many became devoutly Christian and, equally important, literate. A substantial number of those at Freetown were Yoruba peoples. Yoruba, the principal ethnic group or so-called tribe from what is now southwestern Nigeria. Many of these Yoruba subsequently returned to their original home area of southwestern Nigeria, spreading the gospel of their newfound faith and a different but related gospel of modern Western-style education. Among the most prominent of these people was Samuel Ajayi Crowther, and the story of his capture as Ajayi, the young boy at about the age of 8 in southwestern Nigeria, his transport to Freetown, his subsequent return in his 30s back to his original home Yoruba area, is a stirring one. He is eventually appointed by the Anglican Church, the Church of England, to be the Anglican Archbishop of that region of West Africa. Crowther advocated an African-run regeneration, and he used that term, of the Yoruba, and indeed an African-run regeneration of all of Africa. He was not alone. He enjoyed, indeed, considerable success in his time as Archbishop, but his ultimate eclipse, and perhaps even more tellingly, his ultimate replacement by a European, is again suggestive of shifting winds in the 19th century. In the southern part of what is now Ghana, African clergy and school teachers associated with the Methodist Church, in this case, promoted an effort between 1868 and 1873 to establish a confederation of the Fante peoples with a distinctively modern flavor. They drafted a constitution balancing the power of traditional chiefs in the area with progressives like themselves. They set up a rudimentary administration and a military. Part of this was to strengthen themselves in the face of the possibility of encroachment or aggression from the powerful Ashanti state lying to the north, as well as the British presence lying on the coast to their south. This process, this experiment, again, which raises the what-if question about modernization without colonization, was essentially aborted when the British, in 1873, carried out another of the local-level, small-scale annexations of this part of southern Ghana. Now, in East Africa, there was also a commercial renaissance in this interlude period of the 19th century, but not nearly so legitimate. In Lecture 11, we visited the creation of the Swahili, eventually Arab/Swahili world of the East African coast. The traders who were largely the kingpins of that whole commercial culture had been content, of course, for a very long time to allow the products of the interior, the ivory and gold, as well as humans, enslaved humans, to be brought to them. In the 19th century, though, they adopted a far more aggressive attitude. Several, like a man born as Hamid bin Muhammad, but whom the Europeans, and indeed some of his own followers, knew as Tipu Tip, moved boldly to ally with African rulers of the interior and to intensify the exploitation not just of ivory in this case, but very definitely of humans as slaves. Now, these slaves were head for the growing, indeed increasingly booming, plantations of the Swahili coast proper, the East African coast, and to offshore islands like Pemba and Zanzibar. This is the period when Zanzibar's development, for instance, of its clove industry, which still is the dominant industry of that island and indeed produces most of the world's cloves even today. Slaves were intended for destinations on the eastern coast, the offshore islands, or indeed further afield to Persia and Arabia. It was in this period of deeper and wider penetration of the East African interior that Kiswahili, the Swahili language that again we looked at in Lecture 11, a Bantu language, though one which employs a large number of borrowed terms, borrowed vocabulary from Arabic. It is in this period that it became the lingua franca, understood all through East Africa. It's an official language of Kenya and Tanzania today, spoken in Uganda, certainly spoken in eastern Congo, and as far west as the northeastern reaches of Zambia. This is the period when Swahili became one of the most important and widespread of all African languages. And speaking of what-if kinds of questions, Roland Oliver, the eminent historian of Africa, based for many years at the University of London, School of Oriental and African Studies, speculates in his book, The African Experience, that if European power had not arrived in such force at the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, had it not reversed the fortunes of figures like Tipu Tip, that a much, much broader swath of what we would call Central Africa today might indeed be Islamic. Allow me to leave Tipu Tip for a moment and return to him in due course. While all this is going on, needless to say, the currents of change continued to churn in Europe itself. To the Industrial Revolution, with its commercial ramifications for Africa, we may add most certainly a resurgence in Christian evangelism. In a number of respects, the perfect symbol of all of this is the legendary figure of David Livingstone. Livingstone was born the son of a factory worker in Blantyre, Scotland, and I was able at one point to visit the preserved place where he was born and experienced his early boyhood. It's quite astonishing to see what the Industrial Revolution meant for ordinary people in a place like that part of Scotland. The single room which housed Livingstone and his parents and something like 6 or 7 brothers and sisters, while each day during the week the father labored in that textile mill. It's quite a sight to see. Livingstone had gone out early originally to South Africa, where he served his apprenticeship at Kuruman, his apprenticeship as a missionary. But he had also become educated as a medical doctor, and he used, as so many missionaries later did, and missionary societies later did, used the direct service occasioned by their medical skills in order to combine this with the message of their faith. From Kuruman, and that base in the northern part of what is now South Africa, Livingstone began his series of quite extraordinary journeys on foot for a period spanning something like 4 decades. He traversed the entire southern African subcontinent on foot completely, at least twice. He encountered an incredible variety of persons, from reigning kings to those who joined him in an effort to escape from what they considered to be bondage or oppression themselves. And he wrote voluminously about it. His journals today, as well as his published materials, remain some of the most valuable of historical sources for anyone delving into this region. So Livingstone, a product, a son literally of the industrial age, educated not only in the skills of the doctor, but becoming a very devout and indeed energetic advocate of Christian missionary expansion, carries his message, records so much about his experiences all through southern and eastern Africa. When he came back to Britain, he was treated as a returning celebrity. His speeches at places like Cambridge University or in Westminster Abbey attracted hundreds and were reprinted in the organs of the day. He constantly called for people in places like Britain to support him and others in extending the promise, which he called the promise of Christianity and commerce. We might amend it slightly and call it Christianity and legitimate commerce. All of this fed an increased interest, almost a fervor, in going to Africa in a spirit of, I suppose you could call it, paternalist beneficence, and again, to lead the regeneration, in this case, lead it by Europeans as opposed to Africans. Nonetheless, Livingstone himself was not necessarily in favor of outright European colonization. If you read his quite voluminous readings, he is in fact somewhere on the fence, or should I say on both sides of the fence, at various portions of those statements. Maybe not linked directly with European colonization, and yet his name is linked in the popular mind forever with that of Henry Morton Stanley, a fellow Briton, although in this case from Wales, not Scotland, of a very different stripe, a very different personality, and a very different type. He's linked, of course, because in Livingstone's last journeys, when he was feared to be lost, various newspapers financed expeditions to find him, and as you know, Stanley was the one who finally did locate Livingstone near the end of Livingstone's life on Lake Tanganyika, and it was there where he supposedly uttered the immortal words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." It was Stanley working a few years later for King Leopold II of Belgium, a character we will meet in some detail in lecture number 25. It was Stanley who destroyed, on behalf of Leopold, the competing commercial empire of Tipu Tip in what is today the southeastern portion of the Congo. A new era, the colonial era, was beginning. Tipu Tip was sent packing back to his original island home of Zanzibar. A new day, the day of the Scramble for Africa, was getting fully underway. And we turn to that scramble in our next lecture. Thank you.